And welcome to the Performance and Overview Scrutiny Committee of Tuesday, 16th of July. And particularly if you're looking at this as a resident or as business or an interested party outside the Council, you're very welcome. And as we begin the meeting, we will start by just looking at apologies for absence. I know that Councillor Webb sent her apologies. And Robert, any other colleagues?
Yes, Chair. Councillors Crook and Fuchs as well. Okay,
thank you. And I know that you have now sent a formal note to Councillor Fuchs just requesting clarification of her ongoing membership.
Yes, that's right, Chair.
Which I'm led to understand is in hand by colleagues in the Chamber. Thank you. Secondly, declarations of interest. In terms of broad reports that we're looking at today, I see none, so we'll move on to the public open forum is explained in the agenda itself for members of the public, and I would draw your attention to that. If you are interested, it also indicates how you can speak at the meeting if you would choose to do so. And we move on to item 4. We have two main reports in front of us today, and both of them are extremely important. One of them covers overall assessment of performance, self-assessment of performance, and the other one is the financial update report. So we'll start with the self-assessment report. And if I could possibly ask officers to introduce themselves the first time they are speaking, that would be very helpful. And we'll look at we're going to scrutinise this report and identify areas for further scrutiny. One of the issues that we recognised in the pre-meeting was that it's a report of such scale that to do justice to reviewing performance would probably take a day or two, and we'd need every officer involved in performance present, and that's not what we are focusing on. So we're going to particularly look at the approach to performance and additional areas that we think may well need to be considered, and that might be part of the forward work programme. So Richard, over to you. First of all, if you are able to pick out any key points from the report, we'll then move on to questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jay. Good morning, everyone. Richard Jones, Performance and Data Insight Manager for the Council. I'm just going to quickly share the screen, and me and my colleague Hannah will quickly run you through the overall approach we've taken in line with your introduction there, Chair, to the self-assessment report, and just give you a very brief summary of the key headline conclusions as well. So bear with me while I share my screen. Hopefully that seems to have come across successfully. So to give a brief overview of the process and the outcome of our self-assessment report. It's clearly a significant report. It covers, as you rightly say, Chair, the whole Council, and it provides ultimately an assessment of our performance across the financial year 2023-2024. In bringing the report together, we are trying to discharge two important pieces of legislation. Firstly, under the Local Government Elections Act, we have a requirement to keep our performance under review. The principal way we do this is by producing a self-assessment report, which is before you today. And secondly, under the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, we have a requirement to report back and give account of our performance against our wellbeing objectives each year. And those wellbeing objectives are our objectives set within the Community and Corporate Plan. So this report looks to not only bring together assessment of performance, but also the structure and content has been designed to meet those two important pieces of legislation. Our approach to self-assessment principally is focused on three key questions that hopefully you will see run throughout the report. It's very hard. It's about how well are we doing. It's about how well do we know. So what's the evidence that we have to support how well we are doing. And then it's about learning. It's about what and how we can do better where we have identified we need to. So the role of the committee, appreciate your input again, Chair, setting out at the start. First and foremost, it's to involve scrutiny in the development of the draft report. This is a draft report. It's been brought to you quite swiftly, given the process that goes into undertaking it at the end of the year. And it's an opportunity for you to provide any feedback to inform its onward development. It's a tool for you to use in your important role of scrutinising the Council's performance. And as you say, Chair, it's a detailed report. It covers a quite high level and to an extent in some detail a range of the Council service areas, objectives and performance. So should you wish to delve into some of those in more detail, it's an opportunity for you to identify them today and then consider them perhaps further as part of your ongoing work programme where you deem appropriate. So very briefly on the structure of the assessment, as I say, we're trying to cover a wide range of legislation and also make this document as relevant as useful to us as a council, and also then in sharing it outwards and onwards with our residents as well. So we've assessed performance against our objectives set in the community and corporate plan. We've also assessed our performance against some of our seven main enabling functions, so those areas that support us to deliver our objectives. Many of those areas now have either have or in the process of developing strategies that will support their delivery to underpin the focus on our priorities in the community and corporate plan. And then we have an action plan, both identifying what we've already put in place and achieved from the plan from last year, and also an action plan for what we aim to address and improve going forward. So I just wanted to touch on a little bit about some of the developments we made since the last report. It talks about structure of the assessment. I think this is also about our approach to the assessment as well, and how we've tried to draw together the evidence before you today. Appreciate that the committee, along with the feedback from Cabinet, feedback from our peers in terms of WLJ and others, have done some review of self-assessment processes. It's been in place now for a couple of years. We've looked at that feedback, including the feedback from this committee, and made some changes. So it's important just to run through some of those for you today. So we've tried to increase the focus on outcomes. We've assessed the performance under each objective under the what we want to achieve statements, which are outcome focused in our community and corporate plan. And we've also then tried to increase the focus on impact as part of that. So we've tried to challenge in terms of what the evidence is to support our assessment, particularly under the how do we know column. And we've tried where possible to bring in more evidence and a focus on the service user impact, the outcome for residents. We recognise in a self-assessment process covering the whole council there'd always be more to do on that, and I think hopefully you'll see we've taken a step forward this year. Nonetheless, as part of our development of our performance management arrangements, increasing the strength of self-assessment, the evidence underpin it is an ongoing priority. Developing the use of evidence, particularly data within the report. So we have measures of progress under each objectives, set with clear trend and target information. We've added RAGs and performance direction to those to make it easier for those looking at the document to, at a glance, see the progress made in the year. And we've also included a separate performance measures section on its own. So these are measures that were set within the community and corporate plan measurement framework that we'd track to show and demonstrate overall progress against our objectives. And we've also included, where available, some information on Wales comparisons as well, just to give it a glance view of where our performance stands in relation to some Wales comparisons. And then finally, we've also focused on drawing conclusions and improving communication. So by drawing conclusions, we've got our evaluative scores based on our long-standing evaluation framework that underpins each of the scoring of both the objectives and also for those resources areas, those enablers that I talked about earlier. And we've also added in at the start of each objective a strategic assessment which summarises our conclusions at the headline level of the assessment process for each objectives. And again, we've also developed a new action plan stating clearly what we want to improve and how we want to go about that. And obviously, and this committee has reiterated this point many times, this is about ensuring we have clear communication then in this document to our residents. So we produced a summary report. The text of that is appended to the report today. That will be designed going forward to share in a summary view what is the headline findings of a detailed document. We've also, throughout the document, tried to follow a writing guide. I'm conscious 80 pages, and the contribution to this report is right across the council. Bringing that together, we followed a writing guide to ensure consistency in style for the reader, but also consistency in terms of some of those earlier points I made about how we focus on outcome and impact. So it brings us back to that as part of our conclusions. So that's some of the developments we made. I'll hand over to Hannah now, talk us through a little bit of the process and the outcomes we've achieved, and hand back to questions.
Morning everyone, Hannah Carter, Performance Analyst. I'll just very quickly run through the remaining slides. So just on the process of the assessment, we began our desk-based evaluation during April and May, so here's where we gathered all of the available evidence, and we then took this to directorate-based workshops in May and June before drafting the full report in June and July. So as you can see, a fairly quick turnaround to get this to the committee today. The final draft will then be presented to Governance and Audit Committee as per legislation on the 5th of September before council decision on the 19th of September. So we're just moving on to evidence to inform the assessment. This was gathered mainly from intelligence already held. This includes scrutiny findings, including reports presented to this committee, service business plans, audit and inspection reports, strategic risk register, chief officer reports, etc. And we then took this evidence to our directorate-based workshops. So these were held with DMTs in each directorate, and we explored this evidence and challenged it where needed then. And this really helped us to gather officer perspective and ensure it is a self-assessment. We also held sessions with the strategic leadership team as well as, as well as with cabinet too. So moving on to assessing the performance. So, go to the next one. Thank you. So we use a scale of 1 to 6, so where 1 is unsatisfactory and 6 is excellent, so this should be fairly familiar to the committee by now. We've used this in previous self-assessments and also the 6-month corporate plan update as well. So if we move on to the overview, as you can see, all of our objectives have been scored either 3 or 4, mainly 4s. So quickly running through, a fair place to live has been given a score of 4, which is good, and this is unchanged from previous from the 2022-23 report. A green place to live has been given a score of 3, adequate, and again unchanged from last year's report. A thriving and ambitious place has been given a score of 4, which is good, and again unchanged from last year's report. A safe place to live has been given a score of 4 of good, and this is an increase on last year's score of 3. A connected place again has been given a score of 4 of good and an increase on last year's score of 3 also. And lastly, a learning place score of 4, which is good and unchanged from last year's report. So as you can see, some improvement there, but many unchanged, but all rated 3 or 4. And last slide, we've got the enabling function. So we did provide an assessment of these last year, but they weren't scored. But this year we have scored them in line with our objectives. So if I quickly run through, corporate planning, performance and risk management has been given a score of 4, which is good. Financial planning, a score of 4. Workforce planning, a score of 3. Procurement, a score of 3. Assets, a score of 4. Digital and data, a score of 3. And lastly, democracy and scrutiny, a score of 4. And you'll be able to find all the evidence behind these and the reasons behind all these scores within the report. So that just gives a quick overview, and I'll pass back to Rich in case he wants to add anything else.
Thank you for that, Hannah. I think I want to just re-emphasise really and take the opportunity. Hannah's described the process, it's an extensive process right through from each service area, completing a self-assessment through to the report coming before you to scrutiny today. I think just an opportunity really to thank all officers who've contributed to the report so far, and also particularly to Hannah Robertson who've coordinated that work and been able to bring the report together, as you mentioned, in a timely way way, hopefully, so this can be used then to shape and inform future activity. And over to you, Chair.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Hannah, and thanks for picking out some of the really key points, because it's very clear from the pre-meeting that committee members have read the report and looked at the performance in significant detail. So that's very much appreciated. So I'm going to look for questions from committee members, and to begin with, Councillor Buckler.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Richard and Hannah. And Richard, your point that that this self-assessment is to flag up and identify things that need, that need to be concentrated on is very pertinent, because in fact that's what is, what I got from this report were the things that occurred that need more detailed investigation. So, to seek an understanding of the financial strategies and measures in place to manage economic challenges and ensure sustainable fiscal management, could we, be told what specific strategies are being implemented to address the financial pressures facing the Council, and how will the medium-term financial strategy ensure long-term financial sustainability without over-reliance on our lower reserves? I understand these won't be able to be answered right away, but they're sort of important points. My second question is to probe the strategic approach towards environmental sustainability, and how is the Council planning to overcome significant challenges in achieving its net zero carbon targets, and what steps are being taken to secure the necessary public investment and resources to support these environmental initiatives? My third question is the need to address the critical issues of education and support for vulnerable populations, and seeking to understand the specific interventions and support systems being implemented to improve outcomes in these areas. So what measures are being put in place to improve school attendance and support vulnerable learners, particularly those with behavioural challenges? And how is the Council addressing the needs of care leavers to prevent homelessness? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Buckler. Richard, you might well want to take advantage of the fact that you've got finance colleagues in the room with you on the first of those questions at least, but over to you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chair, and maybe bring in colleagues who want to speak. I think, firstly, covering off the financial point, from the self-assessment's point of view, assessing how effective our financial arrangements are, I think in line with Councillor Buckler's point, our conclusion of that is, we've managed the in-year budget position, and we put arrangements in place now for the medium-term financial strategy to set out a longer-term direction. In terms of self-assessment, that concludes that we then need to implement that, including the plans that sit behind it. But I think in terms of the self-assessment, it's clear that, at the moment we are sure that we've got those arrangements in place to plan those through. Similarly, picking up the next point around environmental sustainability, particularly key to achieving our goal around a green place to live. The self-assessment we undertook concludes that, again, we've put in place foundations, building block, and understanding of some of the measures and actions we need to take to achieve that vision. We now have a reset climate and nature emergency strategy and 4 clear action plans that underpin it. The self-assessment concludes, obviously, that the impact of those will then be seen as we continue to deliver those plans, and it's important for us ongoing as part of our assessment under a green place to live objective that we understand the impact those made. Nonetheless, it does identify the challenge that still remains for us. It identifies the challenge that remains in terms of the complexity of some of those issues, but also, as Councillor Buckler says, the financial position and the understanding, linked to the first question, how we prioritise and manage our finances to deliver that will be a challenge, but nonetheless our strategies are focused on trying to deliver our objectives. Moving forward then around support for vulnerable learners and homeless care leavers, again, both issues identified in the self-assessment. Obviously, the importance there, supporting our vulnerable learners. Some of the arrangements already put in place to support their well-being are set out, and we also set out within some of the conclusions of the assessment the importance of ensuring that, those interventions are targeted and we can assess then the impact, but nonetheless, important to recognise work's already been done, but that some of the the challenges and focus remain. Similarly with homelessness and care leavers under under a safe place to live. We've seen through some of the evidence we've drawn together the impact some of the approaches around supporting homeless households in Monmouthshire has made, the impact in terms of reduced use of bed and breakfast, and also the impact in terms of increased homelessness prevention. Nonetheless, again, it recognises there remain challenges for homelessness. I think you rightly identified care leavers as being a focus for us as well, in terms of that continued support around the risk factors that may underpin why people become homeless. So hopefully give a flavour of, from a self-assessment report point of view, both the evidence that underpinned it and also some of the conclusions we've drawn, not just about our assessment last year, but to inform some of our actions going forward, which talk to some of your points. But I'll perhaps see if any colleagues responsible for those areas want to add anything more specifically.
I don't know, Peter, if you wanted to add anything on the financial stability question. I'm sure we'll be picking that up in the next report too.
Thank you, Chair. Peter Davis, Deputy Chief Executive, Section 151 Officer of the Council. I'm not going to talk overly to add extensively to what Richard's noted, and to your point, Chair, we get the financial update report following this, and also acknowledging that the medium-term financial strategy underwent scrutiny last week. Just specifically to respond to Councillor Buckler's question, the medium-term financial strategy is effectively putting in place a strategic framework to guide the Council's finances forward, and keeping it and putting it on a sustainable footing. It's not without its challenges, and Richard's obviously acknowledged those, the committee acknowledged those last week. We've got a significant model budget shortfall over the medium term. We've got, we're moving forward on strong foundations. That was recognised last week. We're looking to build upon those. Strengthening of the budget framework with budget principles that have been added to further in the strategy, a delivery plan that includes a number of targeted reviews, strengthening of the modelling within the MTFP, and an upskilling of finance colleagues and budget holders. So all of those are important, but finally I think the change and improvement plan in the way that it's referred to in the strategy is going to be quite key to enabling that delivery. So I'll probably leave it at that, noting the level of scrutiny that we had on it last week, and obviously the item that follows. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And coming back just to Councillor Buckler, were there any follow-ups or any points that you wanted to press a little more?
No, as noted, we'll be delving into the financial reports afterwards. So thank you, Chair.
Great, thank you, Councillor Buckler. And on to Councillor Bond.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Richard and Hannah, for collating this information. And there's a lot of work being done, and for everybody who's input to the report. It's, as I say, a great lot of work, and well done for collating it so quickly. I've got some questions, but also some builds. So I've noted a few little, because it's such a massive report, there's a few little issues, like units missing, targets, like on the trends, there's no data labels, and some assumptions and some omissions, perhaps things like they're working with food banks, things like that. But so I'm happy to write all those small minor things and questions and send them to you if that's okay. There's a number of things that stick out to me, particularly on page 72, and it's about involvement and stakeholders and partnerships. And this is an area I think that we could do with looking at more deeply, and really around project delivery and change delivery, were they on time, were they in full, were they to budget? and were they fit for purpose? And do you get feedback from the users? Have they been embedded? So around all the changes that have happened and some brilliant work being done, and especially, well, not especially, but I've been involved with the climate side as well. Great work being done, but I'm not sure that we're utilising and consulting with everybody as much as we could be doing to actually adopt all these changes and implement all these brilliant ideas. So I would like to offer or request that perhaps we look further into project management and change management, and perhaps look at the need for rework and waste and the costs that are involved there. So then the other things that jump out to me just a little bit are the increase in or the decrease in usage of trains. Why? There's an increase in rapes. I mean, that just jumped out. And why? And Rachel just said about exclusion. And the other one was about the one spend per head all lower, except in for the rest of Wales on page 83, except for economic development. So I just wonder why that is and what that means, and why is there more spent on that, please? But that you won't be able to answer that question because it's a specific for an area, I guess, and you've done the collation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. So Richard, you see how you do with those, but you may need some clarification.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Bond, for the feedback. Certainly, a fresh pair of eyes on the report is always welcome, so those specific points will be well received. I think probably just overall where some of the data may be missing or some of the trends may be missing, that's a reflection of the speed of the report that's come together, and hopefully in its forward journey, as Hannah described, we'll be able to fill some of those gaps before it's presented to Government's Audit Committee and Council as well. So I think picking up perhaps the overall point you made first about sort of project management change, involvement of service users in the report, I think very important part is about making sure, as I mentioned earlier, that when we're drawing assessment of our performance, we're using the best evidence we can, including the evidence of outcomes and impact on our service users. I think in the workshops we've held with directorates and colleagues in front of me will be able to hopefully reiterate this, that we have focused on challenging service areas to make sure that in drawing their conclusions in the year that they can evidence those and that they're asking their service users for their views on changes. I think we've got stronger evidence in the report than we had last year. Nonetheless, there's as ever an ongoing need to make sure that is as strong as possible. In terms of change and project management. So I think probably just a reflection for the committee really in terms of what we've learnt putting the report together is community and corporate plan sets our objectives as an organisation. The activities that underpin them and the updates we brought for you today try to bring together the various elements of delivery that underpin them, which will include areas of significant change. Underpinning those in the last 12-18 months, the Council has brought, since the approval of the Community and Corporate Plan, the Council has brought forward a number of strategies to support their delivery. To name a few, things like the Economy, Employment and Skills Strategy, the Climate, Nature, Emergency Strategy, some of the underpinning enabling strategies I talked about. This committee's considered some of those things like the medium-term financial strategy, the digital and data strategy, the people strategy. So these all, I think, contribute now and align to the delivery of the Community and Corporate Plan. Each of those, I know, has set out a range of arrangements to both govern their performance management, but also then to support them to evaluate and bring back their assessment of impact individually. And our role for the self-assessment report is to bring that evidence back collectively and how it supports and deliver the objectives. So I think from the evidence we pulled together, there is a framework of strategies, governance and arrangements to report back on those. And I think the ultimate test of those is then bringing those back to say, are they delivering our outcomes within the corporate plan, which this document, on a 6-monthly basis when we bring it to you as a progress report, and an annual basis when we bring it to you as a self-assessment report, aims to do. Nonetheless, as Peter's just described, things like the change and improvement programme that underpin the medium-term financial strategy will be important to that. For example, on those arrangements to be developed, and I think there's a point for us to make sure that from my point of view, it's responsible for the performance management framework in the council. There's a coordinated, structured approach that bring those together as individual strands, but also as collective strands to focus on our objectives. But nonetheless, I think there is a strong foundation already in place there. But perhaps as we go forward, as you would perhaps expect, some need to make sure that's coordinated and joined up where it needs to be and where it's appropriate to do so, because sometimes it isn't going forward. Thank you for then some of the specific points. I made you reminded of some of them, but I think again, if there's specific questions, we can take those back, and maybe things the committee want to look at in a little bit more detail separately. But I think the point you made about sort of economic development spend, I think it's really important that we set some of our context of where some of our spend is relative to other organisations, and that shows where perhaps different priorities lie for different organisations, but also different funding levels as well, and that's what we're trying to stick by including that in the report. But if any colleagues here want to come in on specific ones, Chair, I'm happy to do so.
Okay, Richard, thank you, and also thank you, Councillor Bond, for picking up on the various omissions and typos and matters of that kind. That's very helpful if you are able to send them on. Much appreciated. Were there any other, are you content with those responses, Councillor Bond? Any other points?
Yeah, really just the other thing was about the project management and the engagement of stakeholders and everything. On page 76, there really needs beefing up a bit more about how much you've just explained a lot. Thank you, Richard, about how residents and people have been involved in collaborative work. So, I mean, that needs to be beefed up, really. It looks like all we do is work in partnerships and we don't do anything with and I know that's not true. Thank you.
So
I'll put that in the info.
Thank you, Councillor Bond.
That I send.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. I heard Richard recognise that there may need to be just a quick look at some of these points, and that sounds like one very good one to ensure that we reflect. Apart from anything else, if this is read by any members of the community or looked at, it would be really important that they see their role reflected in it. That's very helpful. Thank you. And moving on to Councillor Howells.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, officers, for bringing this report in such a short time. On a fair place to live, the focus seems to be on income inequality. It'd be nice to have a comparison on how well we're doing in tackling other forms of inequality, such as age, disability, and rural isolation. As was Councillor Buckler in Green Place, I was saddened to see that we're only achieving a level 3 adequate, especially regarding reducing our carbon footprint. I know we are constrained by resourcing issues. However, what action plans are in place to get our zero carbon target back to zero carbon target of 2030? We do know where we are now. We know we want to be in 2030. So it'd be good to see some of those annual steps that we need to be achieving to reach those targets. I'm going to give a plug to the Carbon Literacy Organisation and the work that our officer Hazel Clapworthy has been doing, and encourage more officers and staff, and especially elected members, to take up the offer of going on the literacy training. I see there's 28 officers done it this year, 18 elected members and 5 residents. I've done the course on the community and personal level, and my pledge was to encourage more people to do it. So this is my plug for officers and elected members to take up that course. It's a great way of making sure that we're all working on the same level to go forward with the council. And finally, on page 68, the graphs there could do with a little bit of clarity. I'm not too sure what periods they relate to. I presume it's from 22 to 2028, but just to be specific on that. But a couple of points on one of those. As Councillor Bond mentioned, the train usage was down from 1 million at one point to 625. Car miles, etc. But I'd like to see, more importantly, see bus journeys in there and other forms of active travel, so we can compare and see if we are doing things right, see if there's an uptake on active travel forms, sustainable travel as well. Thanks, that's my 4 points. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor House. Some very interesting points. And Richard, do you want to pick these up?
Yeah, again, thank you for the questions, Councillor Harold. So first point around a fair place to live, focusing on inequality. I think probably worth reflecting that inequality is an overarching priority of the Community Corporate Plan, and that conscious when the fair place to live is a specific focus on certain interventions and measures put in place, particularly around sort of cost of living support, support for implementing universal free school meals, which is now in place. But then throughout some of the other objectives, hopefully you'll see that some of the wider activity the council's put in place to address poverty and inequality, things like supporting people into employment, support available for vulnerable pupils, some of the work that's being done around sort of access to food, etc. But I think that the point's well made about making sure this document reflects the overall approach the councils are taking. I think that's probably an opportunity to talk to one of the areas of development we've got in the report around bringing together a poverty and inequality action plan, which I know is there's already plans in place to address poverty and inequality. That action plan is really about bringing all that together and ensuring, in line with Councillor Howell's question as well, that our activity is targeted and focused on all the different factors that can lead to poverty and inequality and is targeted. So I think it talks to that point. The second question around our action plans support our transition to net zero. That's very much a focus of the Climate and Nature Emergency Strategy, particularly the Decarbonisation Action Plan, which is one of the 4 action plans that underpin it. I said earlier, our self-assessment reflects the work we have done to understand and the ambition we still have as an organisation to deliver those net zero ambitions, but it also talks about the challenge. But nonetheless, we've now, through the years of self-assessments, identified got a clearer plan up to date in terms of strategy, but also then a plan in terms of decarbonisation. Fourth point around promoting the carbon literacy training, obviously important part of our offer. You mentioned the officer who's leading that. I think the assessment recognises we've promoted that to staff. There's potential opportunities to look at how we engage partners and residents in some of that training as well. But again, some challenges in making sure that we can resource and support that as we look to increase and grow it, which is an action in the corporate plan. And I'll perhaps ask Hannah to clarify anything around the measures as bringing those together. But I think overall, perhaps on a specific point around travel, recognising the period, some of these would have covered periods through going back, Hannah, correct me if I'm wrong, periods of the pandemic. So obviously travel usage would have changed through that period in terms of trend. But in terms of, I think, active travel, you mentioned, some of that will be dictated by the availability of data. But we know in Monmouthshire now, for our active travel, we've installed counters to try and get a better picture of people using some of our new and active travel routes, and that's data we'll hopefully bring forward in the report in future from colleagues in active travel to understand the increasing use of those active travel routes, or say the use of those active travel routes more generally. So this is more national data we're using in the tables you described that will enable us to have some local data on walking and cycling. But Hannah, anything to add on the time view?
Yeah, Richard's exactly right. It goes back to around, I think the maximum is about 5 years ago from this year, so that's why you are seeing some dips there in terms of the pandemic data as well. In terms of the active travel, definitely welcome that point. This year they've used the monitoring dashboards to gather baseline data, and so moving forward we will be able to monitor the usage against the baseline data this year. In terms of the bus data and the trains, definitely welcome that point in terms of comparing. It is just dependent on the data that we can gather and the quality of that data that we're able to present, but that's definitely something that we can look into incorporate in the future.
Thanks very much. Thank you. That's great. Thanks. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, and thank you, Councillor Howells. And it's very interesting, the point you raise about age and the potential for people to be excluded. So often we look at that from the point of view of older people, but of course, rural living affects younger people, and the link with bus journeys that you made is an important one. It's a difficult one for us to weave into this, but the ability of us to be able to ensure that as many people living in our towns enjoy the benefits of what we have in terms of the countryside, the rural aspects of Monmouthshire is important. And I suppose that plays into active life. It's active travel as well. It's a very interesting area. And thank you. Councillor Pavia.
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and thanks for the officers for bringing this report forward. Just in terms of stylistic point, given this is a formal document, there are quite a lot of word contractions within there, which would be more akin to sort of casual writing. I wonder if when obviously Councillor Bond sent her corrections over, if that could be looked at as well, because as I said, it is a formal document, and I wouldn't normally see word contractions within a formal document. Just in terms of, and Richard, you might need to take this back to education colleagues, just looking at support for residents and families on low incomes on page 10, and we talk about the rollout of the Welsh Government's Universal Free School Meals programme, and it's clear, whilst there has been uptake, there are issues regarding targeting the families that we would perceive to be needing or accessing that free school meals provision. It's clearly not there yet. I can see that in that paragraph is saying about we are doing more work to look at those barriers that may be preventing families accessing free school meals. I just wondered if there's any early analysis to identify what those potential barriers are. The second question, in relation to the overall scoring of the areas, and just in relation to where potentially a regulator writes a report, and just an example was the Care Inspectorate Wales Performance Evaluation Inspection Children's Services report that was issued last February, and there was a lot of strengths in there and areas of good practice, but there were clearly issues in relation to consistency around the local authority's compliance with statutory requirements for safeguarding children, specifically in relation to the timeliness of child protection visits and child protection case conferences. When a report from the regulator comes up with key issues like that, does that have a weighting on the overall score? Is that picked up by the various departments, and does that affect their analysis of the rating? And finally, I think it's a point I raised last year in relation to the Future Generation Commissioner's Office. And I would like us to do some more collaborative work, maybe some pilot work. I don't know whether any other local authorities have done this, to work with the Future Generation Commissioner's Office to do some independent auditing of our self-assessment. And it may not be right across the board, but it could be in specific areas. Is that something that has been considered? Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Pavia. I'm glad you raised the point too about the Care Inspectorate report on statutory requirements and the aspects of concern. It's set within a wider report where there are very positive aspects to overall performance. Because if I could just add on to that, would it not be appropriate to, in addition to Councillor Pavia's point, for the report on performance to actually identify that was a stated concern in a key report, and this is what has been done about it, as opposed to, you can if you want to follow the link, you can chase it down, a rabbit hole. It just seems such an obvious thing to say, let's be open about it. But Richard, yeah.
Yeah, so again, thank you for the questions, Councillor Pavia, so try and answer them in turn. Again, I think your points about stylistic points. We're trying to make sure, as I mentioned earlier, we've got some consistency in terms of how we draw conclusions for the writing guide. But again, welcome those feedbacks, ensuring then that is consistently applied. The language used is appropriate. We recognise for the report we've got a multitude of audiences we're trying to meet as well, but nonetheless the consistency of that approach is important. So yeah, we'll welcome that feedback and look and review it. In terms of some of the specific points you made, I think to touch on sort of the universal free school meals uptake from a self-assessment point of view. Since community goal plan, we've obviously achieved our goal of rolling those out. Colleagues in the service area have obviously continued to look at then the uptake of those, understand the different uptake, and then look to how they develop that offer to improve or increase further uptake in certain areas. And I think that evidence coming forward is clear in terms of self-assessment point of view that colleagues are looking at that in more detail and continue to strive to increase uptake. As I take the broader issue about sort of the specifics around the Care Inspector Wales report, but perhaps look at it from a broader perspective, you like to say, around how service areas in our conclusion we take account of regulatory audit, inspection, feedback. It's obviously an important element of our evidence base to underpin the self-assessment. Hannah mentioned it in the presentation. It's one of those areas we consider. You'll see, for example, within the learning place example, we draw on some of the STIM recommendations, and in the workshops, which goes into a little bit more detail in the report before you, the evidence we pulled together will rely on some of those conclusions. So I can say we drew on some of the evidence from the Care Inspector Wales report in the social care and health workshop, for example. Nonetheless, I think it's an important point made. We do cover then separately later in the document, as Chair said, the audit and inspection feedback, and the arrangements obviously that are already in place in the council to share that and respond to it. So we won't look to necessarily duplicate that, but nonetheless, as important evidence from the report, I think it's a fair point. We can look to where we have had these key audit reports within the financial year this relates, provide perhaps a little bit more of a summary of that to give the reader a flavour of what some of those key headline outcomes are. Clearly, in the self-assessment report, we may not be able to go into every detail of all those conclusions, but it's important, I think, in line with the point that there's a key evidence and we reflect it. The final point around Future Generations Office involvement, I think we work closely with the Commissioner's Office to develop both our forward-looking wellbeing objectives as well as the role that we play in reviewing and tracking our progress. So we've worked and have used, for example, the Future Generations Office Journey Checker tool, which they're encouraging public bodies to look at now to assess not just in line with self-assessment, but overall how are we as a council developing our arrangements, but also the impact of those arrangements across the 7 wellbeing goals and 5 ways of working. So that's one area we do use it. I think the point around making sure we're using and having peer challenge into a self-assessment process is important because that's helps assure some of the independency and make sure we've got a balanced perspective on our conclusions. So the Future Generation Office is certainly one partner we can work with, just again to give assurance about some of the way that's already designed into the process. So we've obviously, as Hannah's described, got a range of workshops, approach and consultation internally to share the report. We are a member of WLGA networks, so performance policy networks across Wales and Welsh Government have done some light touch analysis across self-assessment reports and fed back some overall conclusions, both in terms of strengths and areas of development. And in line with that list I mentioned earlier of some of the developments we've made the report, some of those things are as a result of that feedback, along with our own internal feedback as well. But nonetheless, that continuing to involve colleagues parts of that, including point one made by Councillor Barry about the Commissioner's Office is one of those we'll certainly look to continue to maintain and implement. Finally, on that point, I think important to raise in terms of peer assessment, the Council under the Local Government Elections Act, as well as the requirement to produce a self-assessment report each year, has a requirement to undertake a panel performance assessment, a peer panel performance assessment once every electoral cycle. And I mentioned that in the cover report. So that will bring together a panel of peer experts, again, drawn from different areas, different backgrounds, to look at then an agreed brief around the council's performance, and again provide that more independent assurance check. So as well as the ongoing annual report, at some point in the near future we'll be undertaking that process. And again, to inform that, we're linking in and working with WLGA, who are providing support, advice, guidance on that process as well. But again, it underpins that importance of any self-assessment process to draw on a wide range of evidence and have some independent assurance checks and balances to the conclusions we draw.
Thank you, Richard. And at this point that I think Councillor Pavia has raised about the that specific example around the Care Inspectorate report, and your comment I think recognises this, that a self-assessment report by any organisation can always attract detractors who say, well, it's a self-assessment report, so what credibility do we give to it? So by actually highlighting areas within the services that are recognised to be in one area or another weak or needing improvement, and what we're doing about it, would really add a huge amount of credibility to the rest of the report, because people would say, well, it's a very open organisation full of integrity. And it might be that actually in the service reports, just that very straightforward point could be built in. What are our weaknesses and what are we doing about them? As opposed to, well, go and look for them if you can. I think it would add an awful lot of credibility to it. But that's not to criticise the report in essence at all. Councillor Pavia, were you content with those responses? Anything else?
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Pavia. And Councillor Strong.
Thank you. Councillor Bond very briefly referred to the issue of rapes, which is dealt with on page 80, if you're using the figures down the left-hand side there. Because what we're dealing with here is not just rape, but also things that fall short of rape, but are still very serious in themselves: sexual assault, sexual harassment, and so on. Now, of course, there's very little, or there's not a great deal, that the council can do to influence the trends there, and the trend is very alarming, of course, when you look at the figures, not least because we don't even know the real extent. These are very much underreported crimes. The exception to that, though, is in our schools. We know that some of these incidents, hopefully not direct rape, but certainly sexual harassment and probably sexual assault, well, I'm almost certain sexual assault, do take place in our schools, particularly our secondary schools. And this is where we have a role. I mean, there is an apparent increase, which I think is probably real rather than just apparent, in the number of these incidents. What I'm really seeking today is a commitment that when we have reports on school issues, either to this committee or to the other scrutiny committees, that we are doing all we can to make sure that schools record all such incidents accurately and in detail, and that schools are, with the help of the council, developing strategies to combat the extent of those incidents. So I'm not looking for a detailed answer to those issues today, but just a commitment that we are working on those and reporting back at every opportunity.
Thank you, Councillor Strong, and it's such an important area. It's also one that I think is very fraught for individual schools to actually develop appropriate strategies, so it's a very well made point. Richard, I don't know if you want to go straight over to Will McLean, who's in the chamber, to address that, and Will, really, this could be a very lengthy issue. It's very much just, I think, to capture and recognise that this is something we want to look at, but over to you, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everybody. Will McLean, Chief Officer, Children and Young People for Monmouthshire. Thank you, Councillor Strong, for the question. I think just, You're absolutely right. And clearly Estin and the kind of the wealth of evidence that came out in the last couple of years about the experience, particularly of young girls in our schools, was shocking. And Estin, I think, rightly shined a light on it. So there has been lots of work across Monmouthshire to help support schools, not least the adoption of a new relationships and sexual education curriculum, which at the heart of that has to be kind of the really strong teaching in our schools. So that's the kind of the key driver in that instance. If there are any instances, then obviously the authority does respond to support schools, make sure that any cases have properly been handled in terms of the safeguarding, any risk assessments and so on need to be managed effectively for all learners, and that's both in terms of the victim in school to make sure they're supported and able to stay in school. But clearly, I think the fundamental point is that we need all of our schools to capture that accurately. And I'd rather, see initial spikes in recording where things are caught accurately. It's the same across all issues. You need that accurate capture because that gives you the opportunity to understand the scale of the issue, and it then allows you to put in place the proper processes to support our teachers, our support staff, and our schools more broadly.
Thank you, Will. It's such an important area. Councillor Strong, are you content with that?
Yeah, happy with that, but would like to make sure that it's actually included in writing, or some details included in writing, in appropriate reports that come before the various committees.
Thank you, and point really, really well made. It's also interesting to note the rate of fixed-term exclusions, which will be for a wide range of reasons, of more than 5 days per thousand, significantly more than doubling over the period that's related in these charts. The point was made earlier. I'm not sure it was picked up on. I think it was by Councillor Howells that the time frame of those charts, I'm looking at the one on page 70, 71, it's not immediately clear. It would be good to make sure that they are clear. And thank you for those questions. Just one or two other points and questions, if I may. I'd like, first of all, to say thank you for the report. It's an awful lot of detail in it, and it's been very worthwhile working our way through it, and there's a lot in the reading of it that is very informative. It does raise a lot of questions. Also, thank you for building in, to the extent that we now are, other wills, all wills comparisons. We've made that point before, and I can see you've responded to that. I think we can do more in that regard, because performance in isolation in many areas really doesn't tell us very much. It just becomes a number. We can see the difference over a period of time, but how are we doing against other authorities? But well done for beginning that process. It would be good to see more of that. It's also good to see you picking up on the committee's request previously for more service user feedback. So what do service users, how do they rate our services? And I think that's very healthy, and again, really encourage more of that. The self-assessment report is a requirement under the Local Government and Election Wales Act of 2021, so there's a reason for it to be written from that point of view. But there's a much, much better reason, if I put it that way, to actually put this data to use. So one of the questions that sits there for me is to what extent and how frequently is performance information used within our services to drive performance improvement. Do we have formal monthly, quarterly, the annual, or is it just a report that comes out externally? It'd be useful just to have an understanding of that. One of the most important performance areas from what we looked at a year ago in terms of the service plans was transformation within the services to be able to meet budget challenges, which by that stage were very clear and very well established after one full year of the administration. And it's very difficult to find much evidence of performance review or performance assessment of transformation or change gone on over the last year. And again, I can't quite understand why that would be the case when it is very important. for the next year, we've identified in the strategy, or it was identified in the finance strategy that we looked at last week, that there needs to be change to, and I may not be quoting verbatim, but the words I think that were used in the report were a radical change to the model, the operating model within the council and by implication to services. So it seems extremely important that the transformation that and radical change that is specifically pointed at in last week's finance strategy is closely monitored, and performance of that is brought out, and that we may well want to look at that as we go through the year, because it is so critical. And yeah, it's worth noticing. I noticed our new Prime Minister made the comment last week that the most important step for policy is to go through scrutiny, and I thought, absolutely great. He obviously got my email. But it is just to highlight the questions that committee members are making and the suggestions and the scrutiny that we need to give it is the reason why we are here as a committee. But it is with the aim of trying to improve and strengthen the quality and the performance of the overall council and its services. So I hope those points are well understood. And Richard, just on those couple of points, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to say to them in terms of the way that we use performance within services, and secondarily how we'll go about really assessing the radical improvements that we need to see happening, changes that we need to see happening over the next year.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you for the overall feedback as well, and recognising hopefully the feedback from the committee last year is being acted upon. So pick up points around performance framework. I'll probably, as part of that, also talk about how some of the programmes the council has developed are now embedded within that framework and being monitored as well. The self-assessment report is a product of a process at the end of the year that continues throughout the year and continues on an ongoing basis, even when we're producing this self-assessment report itself. So self-assessment process, as you rightly say, is important because it's important for us to understand and learn. We also do it because there's a legislative requirement, but that fundamental purpose is to use it to drive improvement and understand our performance. So we embedded it within our performance management framework. We've appended that broadly as part of the cover report to give you a flavour of how it operates, and just to probably briefly take the committee through how it operates and embeds self-assessment. So at a service level, we've got each of our service plans has a plan in place that guides its activity for the next 2-3 years in the medium term. Within that plan, they set actions that align to deliver the community and corporate plan. They set performance measures to guide and monitor their progress, and they identify and monitor their risks. That's this sort of core for those plans. Each of those service areas update and review those on a regular basis. There's a formal requirement to review them on a quarterly basis, but also we encourage in services to update them and use that performance information regularly. Those service plans are available internally on our intranet for anyone to use. As a team, we monitor the timeliness of completion and also the quality of those plans, and provide feedback to the plan holders, and we also report into Governance and Audit Committee as well around our own assessment of the effectiveness of those plans. So those are really the drivers which service use on a regular basis to monitor and manage their performance. As part of that requirement, they're required to self-assess, to not just monitor their performance quarterly, but to produce an annual self-assessment. That really is the foundation of the report before you today. So those 50 service areas assessing their performance in line with the community and corporate plan objectives. We aggregate that then through, draw that together as a desk-based exercise, aggregate that through to directorate workshops and through to the report, which I won't repeat what Hannah's described. So that's helping us embed the report, and equally, the only way self-assessment works if you derive it from those service areas who are delivering it. And we've talked a bit about today, some of the improvements we made in the process, but also some of the further areas for development as well. So that's driving our work. I think picking up the point around transformation, change, the community corporate plan sets ourselves clear objectives for the council. As I mentioned earlier, that the plans that support and underpin those over the last 12-18 months have undergone and been subject to a range of developments to align and deliver those, whether they be things like climate and nature emergency strategy, economy, employment and skills strategy, some of the enabling strategies that underpin them, to more specific approaches dealing with specific issues such as just a few examples, the rapid rehousing approach being taken on homelessness. So I think when probably with the committee reflecting on each objective, I hope for the committee, and I think demonstrates some of the progress made on some of that change, improvement, development that the council's undertaken, and really sits those at the point of, are they then looking to achieve the council's outcomes set within the community and corporate plan. Nonetheless, as we mentioned, there are still strategies being developed, important one being the medium-term financial strategy and the plans that underpin those. But again, I think those are designed to deliver on our community and corporate plan objectives. And I mentioned earlier, there may be some work to do to make sure that the arrangements in place then are coordinated, integrated into the
position forecast at month 9. The improvement is primarily as a result of an improvement in service budget positions driven by the budget recovery action enacted by services during the year, including staff vacancy restrictions, coupled with improvements in the cost of capital financing as areas of the capital programme have experienced delays. There remain significant areas of cost pressure within adult social care, children's additional learning needs, waste, and homelessness and housing. These services recorded a cumulative overspend of £5 million for the year, and whilst a significant aspect of these cost pressures were accommodated in the 2024-2025 budget, this continues to present an ongoing area of financial risk for the council in the new financial year. Total capital expenditure for the year was £65,176,000, with no capital schemes reporting material over or underspends that require additional financing from the council's own resources. Capital slippage requests total £28,606,000. Of particular concern is the significant reduction in schools' balances during the year of £5,161,000, as outlined in Appendix 1 and Appendix 3. That takes the cumulative school balances into deficit by £905,000. 13 schools ended the year with a deficit balance, with several schools continuing to carry structural budget deficits that will need to be addressed by way of budget recovery action. I'd also like to draw attention to the early indicative cost pressures of £873,000 highlighted by services against the 2024-2025 revenue budget that require prompt mitigating action by services in order to deliver a balanced outturn position by year end. And I look forward to answering any questions from the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Callard, and we'll move straight on to questions. So I'm looking at any hands that are being raised, and if you have any questions. I see Councillor Buckler's hand. Councillor Buckler.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Callard, for introducing this very important report, which is has a lot to comprehend and delve into. I'd like to know what specific measures are being considered to address the ongoing financial risks in adult social care, children's additional learning needs, waste and homelessness, and housing for the upcoming fiscal year. And what specific steps will you take to ensure that the significant overspends are addressed promptly and sustainably? And what measures are being implemented to improve efficiency and reduce overspend in these key areas? Are we developing more contingency plans for each service area to manage unexpected costs better? Because that seems to be a running theme, that there are unexpected costs coming towards us. So do we need to have a better structure in place? Are we engaging with stakeholders, including staff and service users, to identify potential efficiencies and areas for cost-saving measures? And a last point, how do you plan to reallocate services from underspent areas like Treasury and reserves to critical overspend services to ensure financial management is balanced? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Buckler. Councillor Callard, did you want to start or to hand across to?
Yeah, I'll just start and then I'll hand over to the officers if that's okay, Chair. I think there's lots of very valid points in there, Councillor Buckler, regarding the specific actions that are being taken. I think what we've seen in this outturn position is the budget recovery action, which was put in towards it was probably the end of the third quarter, early fourth quarter last year, is really started to bear fruit, which is why we're seeing this improvement in the position that we've seen from months 9 into outturn. It's a piece of work that continues. The financial strategy, looking into the future, I think builds on that. And as we discussed last week, the financial plan, when that comes forward, will further build on those ideas where we can, look to make our services more resilient. Regards the point about the overspend in the services is kind of offset a little bit by some of the gains that we've had in the corporate costs and levies. I think that's a situation that I'm happy with. We'll take the gains where we can get them in order to better support our services. The cost drivers on these services have been increases in demand, and we spoke last week about the importance of accurate forecasting in order to inform the budget so we can make sure we're allocating our resources correctly. That point still stands, and we've taken that data and our learning from last year into this year's budget. But if it's okay, I'll bring in Peter Davis now and hopefully he can flesh out those points a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Callard. To Peter Davis.
Thank you, Councillor Callard. Thank you, Chair. So I'll maybe just provide a sort of further comment in a rounded way, but drawing back to the points that Councillor Buckler placed with us to respond to, and then maybe just allow for other officers to lead in if they want to offer further comment. So I think just in terms of the means by which we look to react and respond to, I guess, the list, I guess, that was sort of referred to of areas which we have seen a lot of demand, complexity and pressure working through. I think you referred, Councillor Buckler, to adult social care, children's services, waste, housing, homelessness. And I think if you just if you reflect on those areas and in terms of what you've seen, not just embraced by the budget strategy and approach, but by measures that the council has taken. So in adult social care, practice change that is featuring and inbuilt. It's commented on, I think, in the supporting papers to the report, and that's been practice change that's been developed and worked through as part of the last budget round or last financial year as well as this year's. And progress is being made, and a level of significant saving has already been achieved in that area. We've also seen domiciliary care commissioning strategy brought through Cabinet, which again adds some greater rigour and strength to our commissioning approach, and in terms of being able to sort of manage and contain costs in obviously a volatile and high demand area. Similarly with children's services, one and the same, and in terms of that sort of risk-based approach that's been taken by Diane Chorister and Jane Rogers and the teams, and we've seen the children's placement strategy introduced as a response, not just to eliminate, but in being able to actually introduce more effective, cost-effective ways of providing the right type of accommodation for vulnerable children that are either under our care or otherwise. Housing and homelessness, I think Richard talked earlier as part of the self-assessment report in terms of the rapid rehousing sort of approach, and obviously we've seen a lot of improvement in terms of cost containment and saving being introduced as a result of being able to bring forward more temporary accommodation. It's a feature of the in-year budget, was a feature of last year's budget. I think one thing that is given, I could go on, but I think one thing that is a given is change is the norm. I think we've had that. We've had to sort of inbuild change into our DNA as a council for many years, and that's embedded within the budget process, within the community and corporate plan, the service plans that Richard talked to in the last item. In terms of engagement with staff service users, I think that's addressed in a number of ways. I think in terms of cost containment mitigation, so where we've had overspend, it's a feature. So, let's reflect on the report. This is in the main a backward-looking report at last year. I think we've travelled together on this journey through Scrutiny, and in terms of the significant challenges that were initially reported in the year, the budget recovery mechanisms were introduced, the strengthening of the financial management arrangements, the financial management board being introduced, and stronger communications with wider leadership and staff communications, and that's all of that, and the excellent efforts of sort of colleagues have sort of led us to this point, which is a much more positive outturn position that we were certainly staring down the barrel at in the early part of last financial year. The final point on that, transferring of service underspends to areas of overspend, I think Councillor Carlard's right. We take those gains, when they're afforded to us. But I think in an in-year situation where, and you will, I'm just saying, where you will encounter overspends, you've got to take a budget in the round and understand as to what courses of action you need to take. I think in the way that Jonathan's helpfully brought the report together, it's a backward look in the main, okay, but it also takes a very early look at some of the pressure points that we're seeing in this early part of the year. I'm not getting too overly concerned about that. I think it's in about the £1 million territory. Yes, and obviously through strategic leadership team down through DMTs in discussion with Cabinet, we're obviously looking to put in levels of mitigation at local levels and more broadly. Those are just being worked through at the moment, but I think month 4 will be another key point in the year, as it was last year with where we were in reporting last year. I think the environment is very much different this year than it was last year. Inflation is certainly not with us in the way that it was. But again, to your point of over-underspends, we take decisions in the round. We determine the level of budget recovery action that's needed, depending on what our up-to-date financial information is telling us. And if there is any systemic underspend, I think Councillor Buckler, to your point, so for example, if you're seeing a level of ongoing, recurrent year-on-year underspend, then you would expect to see that addressed as part of the annual budget process, and that sort of resource allocation that I think you're alluding to. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Councillor Buckler, were you content with the responses?
Yes, thank you, Chair. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Moving on to Councillor Bond.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, everyone. Real congratulations on a lot of good work has been done, and as you've said, a lot more to do. My question really is about, you suggested that staff vacancies has helped with the budget situation. And my thoughts are around the pressure on the existing staff. I know you've just mentioned, both Peter and Councillor Callard, that reorganisation has happened, but I think I've said this before, the pressure on existing staff, have we seen any issues versus well-being and mental health issues, and also retention? And I think you've mentioned it slightly as well, the effect on delivery to residents of the services. Of course, if people leave and you've got vacancies, as was suggested earlier, that you might have the wrong people in the wrong place. So I guess the task management of the particular service and the identification of where to best fit the resources is something you've alluded to, but could you expand on it, please?
Thank you, Councillor Bond. And Councillor Callard, did you want to pick up on those first of all?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Bond, for the questions. I think it's a really valid question, and it's something that we need to make sure we get right, because we rely on our staff for the running of this whole organisation, and making sure that we've got a contented, motivated team is so important to the effective delivery of our services. I'll bring in the officers in a moment just to expand a little bit about where we are carrying some vacancies and where those positions have been formalised. But I would just add that where we do have demand, we are recruiting. You will see if you're on social media, all the adverts go out from the authorities' social media accounts to fill positions, because it's not like there's been a stop on vacancy. It's just where we believe we can absorb that capacity within existing teams, that has been done. And I'd also add that we keep a really close eye on staff absences and sickness and the reasons behind those, and currently we are not seeing an increase in absences due to stress, workloads resulted stress. So at the moment, it seems to be a stable situation. I mean, I'm sure there will be pockets in the authority where people work, and they do work under a lot of pressure, and we know a lot of our staff work incredibly hard to deliver our services. So, it's a good opportunity for me, I think, now to thank them for all the work that they do in delivering the services. But yeah, I'll hand over if that's okay, and hopefully, Peter, one of the officers, can share a little bit more about the criteria whereby we have kind of formalised those vacant positions.
Thank you. Peter, did you want to pick anything up there?
I'm just reflecting on whether I need to actually offer any further comment. I think Councillor Callard's input was very rounded and in responding to the question. So I don't know, Chair, as to whether Councillor Bond is satisfied with that, or whether there's any further clarification she'd like.
Yeah, thanks. Councillor Bond.
So that deals with, thank you very much, that deals with really looking at the staff themselves, but the other area was, as you alluded to, Peter, delivery to residents, ensuring that we are still maintaining that delivery of services at the same level.
Yeah, I think it's a given, in all honesty, and obviously you'll understand in the nature of a local authority and in terms of the whole variety of services that it provides. Many of those essential, and many of those to vulnerable elements of our communities. There's a need for effort to be prioritised accordingly. And back to Councillor Callard's points, the workforce has been under strain. We are not alone. So when you take the sector more widely, and the recruitment challenges that are faced in certain and very specific areas, and helpfully sometimes in areas where there's also levels of increasing demand. So a set of wicked issues, but I think certainly in the way that, when we just take a lens to some of the more important areas. I know we haven't got Jane Rogers as Chief Officer for Social Care Care and Health with us today, but I'm sure she would have reflected on the way that they've had to adapt and obviously allocate resource to the front line, making sure that effort is being prioritised. And I know that the tempo that they operate at is on a daily basis in terms of casework, both in terms of review and response. So it's at that level of granularity that you'd expect operations to operate. I'm not going to smooth this over. It's not without its challenges. It's been, a pretty tough year. And we know we've got a challenging environment going forward. And whilst you can take a very black and white, one-sided look at, the financial strategy and a £34 million budget shortfall and the need to instigate a change and improvement programme, but I think we probably all recognise the values that this council holds good to, and that point that you raise in terms of, well-being and our duty of care to staff, it's fundamentally important because you've got to maintain, good morale across the workforce, and we carry a lot of goodwill in and across this organisation, and it's really important that, we pay that back, we continue to pay that back and maintain it, notwithstanding some of the difficult decisions that we're going to have to take to drive through the change that's needed over the medium term. So it's the balance, as always, that's got to be struck.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
I think we're all recognising that it is very challenging. The purpose of the questions is to see where the areas are that perhaps need to be given more attention and concerns that might exist there. But I'm sure across the committee we recognise that it's a very challenging environment. So moving on to Councillor Pavia.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for officers for the report and Councillor Callard as the cabinet member for presenting. Just following on from Councillor Bond's question about staff shortages, are there any service areas where we're becoming service critical, when we're on, close to the edge in terms of having that staff capacity to deliver key frontline services? In relation to 3.14 and the savings that were the council were trying to secure at the end of last year, we only met 83.3% of those savings. So I assume that the 16.7, 17% has sort of rolled over to this financial year, and in that. The social care and health element only managed to meet 70% of its savings target. So it's given that in this financial year that again we tasked the social care department to secure even greater savings. I think it was in the region of £4 million. What is the expectation now on health and social care in relation to that last 30% that wasn't realised at the end of last year? Is there any additionality this year, or do we expect in terms of service redesign and that'll be mitigated? And finally, in terms of education, I think the report, the back end of the concluding element of the year, I think we identified, was it 15 schools in deficit? I don't know whether, I know there's some
13.
Chief Officer. 13. Sorry, thanks, Chair. I know the Chief Officer is in the chamber there. We might be able to update us on that figure. There's two elements here. How are we doing with squeezing surplus places out of the system? And in terms of overall school budgets, much of that is staff costs. We understand that. But where there's areas of maintenance budgets and maintenance work, and just sort of reflecting on a quote that, because I'm a governance at Mary's in Chepstow, a quote that we've received from a provider on the authority's procurement framework. And I think some of the costs within there were quite considerable in terms of where the market would be in terms of delivering on some of those areas of maintenance. I just wondered, are we monitoring those companies that are on our procurement framework with those quotes that are coming out to schools to ensure that we're getting value for money? Are we doing that active monitoring to see that they are pitched at the right level and they are schools are paying out the right sums for the work required. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Pavia. And who wants to pick those up? Councillor Callagher, did you want to start?
I'll just come in briefly, if that's okay, before handing over to the officers. Thank you for the questions, Councillor Pavia. There's some quite technical questions there, so I'll be relying on the officers to answer those where possible. And I would also add that, unfortunately, Jane Rogers, the Chief Officer of Health and Social Care, can't be here today, so it may be that we need to come back to you with some of those answers, but we can follow that up. On your question about resource levels and have we got any services where we are critical with our resource, I would say not at the moment, but we are aware of service areas where we provide, where we can struggle to recruit and retain. I think social care is a classic example of that. It's a risk that we've identified as an authority and something that we will keep monitoring. But it's something that we're very conscious of, and that we need to, I guess, keep selling. Monmouthshire is a great place to come and work, and live as well. So I think that's a really valid point and something that we're keenly aware of. If it's okay, I'll hand over for the answers to the other questions. I know you mentioned we've got Will McLean here, who I hope can pick up the points on school balances. And also, there's a bit about procurement, whereby the requirements that we place on the contractors on the authority's approved list, and whether those requirements, how they, I guess, interact with providing value for money for taxpayers at the same time. So I'll hand over for that, if that's okay. But thank you for the questions.
Thank you. So in terms of the staff shortages question and social care meeting its financial savings, that might be something, Pete, that you want to pick up on, and then Will McLean on the schools that are in deficit currently.
If okay, Chair, I'll maybe hand across to Jonathan. Jonathan's probably more well-armed to provide a rounded response on this, notwithstanding the fact that obviously myself and Jonathan, are very close to Jane and senior colleagues, and in terms of keeping track of progress, and key risks within social care and health. So over to Jonathan, thanks.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Jonathan Davis, Head of Finance. So just touching briefly on the first question, Councillor Pavia, I think if I was going to probably take a short answer to it, it would be no, we aren't seeing those risks manifest at the current time. Obviously, we'd have to go down on a kind of service by service level to answer that more fully. But in terms of key service delivery, we're not seeing that impact. It remains on our risk register as a strategic risk. So that is being monitored regularly as we move forward, and remains central to service delivery. In terms of the second question, just in terms of that underachievement of budget savings delivery, if we just reflect back to what was probably the budget process for 2022-23, the social care savings package, as it was then, was brought forward, and through the scrutiny of that, it was felt that was too ambitious to deliver within a single financial year, and as an authority we utilised some reserve funding to smooth that process over 2 financial years. What we're seeing, I guess, is good progress being made. I think 100% delivery was going to rely on everything working perfectly, external factors playing into our favour, and all of those things that we were trying to develop in terms of the practice change, the relationships with partners across health and the regional teams as well. So the work is ongoing. It's changing. I think some of the things that perhaps we thought were possible and the right approach right at the start would have changed as we've moved through that process. So teams will be adapting to that, and I think they're appreciating that the flexibility is needed within this, and the approach to the children's services placement has seen that, and that changing approach to how we've adapted to those high complexity and cost cases coming on stream. So the short answer to your initial question, which was, how do we deal with that 30% that wasn't delivered? That will roll up into the budget position for 24-25, and will form part of the budget that social care is working towards. Obviously, presents an additional challenge, but one that has been being responded to for the past 18-24 months and continues to adapt. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Councillor Pavia, were you content with those responses?
Yes, Chair. I obviously welcome the Chief Officer for Education's response on the education side. I suppose just in response to Jonathan's response to me, in relation to those, as you said, as Jonathan said, aligning everything, making sure everything was coming in our favour, and he mentioned partnerships, and obviously clearly an element within the report is the disagreement between ourselves and health in relation to children and young people's continuing care and continuing healthcare for adults. It seems as though we're particularly health are looking to make specific savings within that budget area. I'm just wondering, if we're going to have to come to a situation sooner rather than later where judicial action may be required to force our health partners to take on their responsibilities. We're shouldering a considerable amount of cost where it's clear many of these cases are health cases. So, in terms of those partnership arrangements, I don't know whether officers may not want to respond, and it may come from the Chief Officer for Social Care in due course, but it's something I think officers should be mindful of. Thanks, Chair.
Councillor Pavey, thank you for that. I think we definitely recognise that continuing healthcare is a real challenge for all authorities, and the decision-making rests with the NHS more than it does with the local authority. I think if I could simply ask what level of expectation, because I think what we were able to achieve was 171,000 out of the 550 that was in the budget. Moving forward, are we placing the same level of ambition from continuing healthcare in this financial year, or have we reduced our expectations from that? I don't know whether Peter or Jonathan you'd be able to address that.
Thanks, Chair. I haven't got the figures to hand. I think I think it's important that we recognise that this is a two-way process. I think we've heard previously in this committee, Councillor Pavia, that there will be negotiations that are ongoing with health where we are looking for that responsibility to pass back to health in some cases, and in others they will be looking to pass others over to us. So there's a balance to be struck, and I think measured negotiations with health and constructive ones are where we're looking to be at the moment in time. That obviously comes with a risk, which we've highlighted in the report in terms of delivering on those savings targets. But as we go through the year, it's important that we continue with those constructive negotiations with health colleagues.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. We'll move on, and Councillor Howells.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, officers. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I do beg your pardon, and thank you, Robert. It was the question, Will, of how many schools had fallen into deficit this year. So thank you, and apologies for overlooking that.
Not at all. Thank you, Chair. So I think Councillor Pavia's question. So there are 13 schools in deficit at the end of the financial year, which is clearly a significant increase from where we had been last year, which was at 5. But historically, it's not as high as it was pre-pandemic. So pre-pandemic in 18-19 we had 15 schools, and 19-20 17 schools. So I think lots of the narrative around the schools position has been around the proper use in terms of the funding that was afforded to schools through the Welsh Government for the kind of the recovery stages post-pandemic, and we're now seeing that kind of return back to where we were previously in terms of the number of schools. So in terms of the two specific aspects you talked about, the squeezing of surplus places, so we obviously fund on a pupil-led basis, and we need to make sure that we're funding our pupils as much as we can. Clearly, that's our aim and our target. So the surplus places piece is really about making the most efficient use of the estate as we can. We do have some areas where there are significant surplus places, and we're working both within the admissions team to understand what future demand might be, but also looking across some of the reasons for that. Some of the reasons why surplus places can look high in certain communities is kind of the presence of Welsh language schools. So schools teaching the Welsh medium tend to have a higher number of surplus places in Monmouthshire than English medium schools. So that's a piece of work which is continually in hand, and one which we're looking to kind of always keep live on. And the work that we've been doing in Chepstow focuses on that in terms of surplus places as well, because that can drive some behaviours as well that aren't always helpful. The piece around the costs around maintenance. So the costs associated with maintenance, you're absolutely right. And schools have come back to us and talked about the costs which they're being kind of quoted for some, I guess, what especially governors think are kind of small pieces of work, and I think that can lead to frustrations. It's the responsibility of the schools and the governing body to do that work. They have to go out, they have to get the 3 quotes. They also have to work within the frameworks of property services to make sure that the work they're doing is at the right level and the right standard. But it is something I think we can work more closely with the schools on to ensure that their strategic procurement is as effective as it can be. And if that means working on cluster basis or on smaller groups of schools, then that's something which we'd look to do to support them into the future. I hope that helps.
Well, thank you. That's very, very helpful. The question, I think, was also in terms of, as we're now in the second quarter of the next financial year, 13 schools in deficit at the end of the last one. Have you got an update on the position for the current year?
So we're currently working through the budget with the schools. So schools have a slightly different timeline in terms of setting their budget. So the budgets have to be set by the 31st of May, and then they have to submit by the 31st of July their recovery plans. So colleagues are working through those at the moment. I think what we're seeing at the moment are some, I wouldn't describe it as positive, but some green shoots in terms of performance by schools and what they're looking at. We've seen a couple of schools really kind of come forward with really quite robust savings plans, but I don't have those specific numbers to hand for you, I'm afraid, at the moment, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to, thank you, Will. Moving on to Councillor Howells.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Callard and officers for bringing the report. My question on page 22, I see the debt care charges are still running high at 2.2 million over 463 clients, which I believe it averages about 4,700 per client. is this just a delay in payment, or are these genuine sort of cases of hardship that we're maybe going to have to sort of just embrace and sort of like write off or whatever? But I'd be interested to know a little bit more about that. And just some with regards to Mon Life, the Borough Theatre and the attractions, reduced income from those. I mean, these are vital for our tourist industries and for residents alike, actually. I was just wondering what's been put in place to, increase that footfall, to get people through those doors, to make them profitable. And I draw attention to the Newport Leisure Park service charges and the Castle Gate service charges. The service charge met centrally for vacant units. I thought we were optimistic about those being let, the units. I was just wondering if there's any update on the uptake of new leaseholders for those units. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Howes. And it's very interesting you raised the question of Mon Life, which I think was underspent by 209,000, because that's an area that many of our residents will notice, where it's a smaller number who necessarily notice the social care services, and it's a real dilemma, I know, not for only our council but for other councils. How do we maintain the confidence and support of our residents through these challenges? It underscores the point we were talking about last week, I think, which is they need to really understand why we're doing things, and we're doing things effectively in order to show their support for areas of underspend or reductions in expenditure for the services that they also really care about. It's a very interesting aspect. But just handing across to, I don't know, Councillor Callagher, did you want to pick up those, or to hand across to officers?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Howes, for the questions. I will hand over to the officers for the majority of them, but just on that point about Mon Life underspending, I think it's probably more fair to frame that as an outperformance in terms of increasing memberships, some extra grant funding. I mean, we did see some cost pressure there, but actually that directorate outperformed rather than underspent. So it's something that I was pleased to see. The question on debt, I'll bring in Jonathan Davis, if that's okay, if I can hand over to John Davis.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Councillor Howes, for the question. I think it's a risk in terms of debt recovery that we're seeing, across, income generating services across the authority. It's one which, has been central to our kind of internal risk register over the past 12 months. I think we've just got to be cognizant of the wider external economic picture, the cost of living crisis that has been in place, that has impacted on being able to recover our debt. That's both in terms of social care, but also more widely than that in terms of council tax, for example. What we have seen overall is a reduction in debtor levels in totality. I think specifically in terms of social care, we are looking to bolster some of those arrangements we have in place around the debt recovery function, and bring in a little bit more support for that. We need to work constructively again with I think you mentioned around 460 clients there that are owing debt, so we need to work constructively and sensitively with them in the current climate. Cost pressures in households, inflation, yes, is coming back towards a core 2%, for example, from being where perhaps we'd experienced double digits within the financial year that we've just been talking around. So we've got to recognise that, but regardless of that, there's a debt there that is outstanding and needs to be paid. So we'll be continuing the work on that, but remain central to us in terms of that risk as we move forward.
And the question about service charges on the vacant units.
Thanks, Chair. I'm just going to come in and just going to supplement sort of John's input, just to, I guess, provide a little bit of context. So, point well made in terms of the figure drawn to in terms of age debt in the report. It's part of a clear focus. So when myself and Jonathan meet regularly, as we do with both adult social care and children's services, in the adult social care domain where the majority of this debt sits, it's a feature of our conversations. I think in terms of Jenny Jenkins, in terms of working with the wider workforce and in and alongside finance, it's been able to strengthen those arrangements at the front end. So it's important that somebody who's looking to enter into a situation where they are in receipt of care, and whether as a result of assessment a need to pay for that is known at the beginning. It doesn't subsequently become known. That becomes a much more challenging situation. So there's been work ongoing just to sort of strengthen that that level of ownership at the front line with social workers and the like. Furthermore, and I think John's touched on it in terms of sort of strengthening, I think, the capabilities, which in the debt recovery team for social care is specific. It's away from our corporate team. It's actually sat within the social care finance team, so it's closer to the service and looking again, as John said, to sort of strengthen those arrangements. And then the other contextual bit, which is always the case with when when you band around global figures of age debt, it's what's actually properly aged. Yeah. So some will be collectible in the normal course of business. Some will be where payment plans have been introduced and you'll recover that debt over a longer period. And there are situations where we having to go through legal proceedings in order to gain recovery to that debt. And yes, there are situations, given the sort of client cohort, where we do have to take a balanced decision in terms of write-off or otherwise. Clearly, John and the team's just brought the draft accounts through. They've just gone over to Audit Wales for the start of the audit process, and as part of the year-end accounts, bad debt provision will be reassessed and put in place to make sure that we've got the cover for the necessary cover in place for the potential for bad debt. So context is important, if you get to my point around all of that. In terms of the Cascade and NLP piece, a much shorter input. I think it's just to acknowledge that I think as the budget monitoring has captured through last year, I think we've gone through a period of consolidation. I think we all understand, with Mitel leaving as anchor tenant or significantly leaving as anchor tenant, Nick Keys and the team has been doing a really good job in terms of sort of evolving and reshaping the tenant base at Castlegate, and that's worked well. But obviously, as you manoeuvre your way through that, it's a case of just understanding that you're going to have to accept with new tenants coming in, potential rent-free periods, etc., as well as obviously the marketing of those space that's been freed up. I think we're in a positive place, certainly in the current year and certainly moving forward. And in fact, similarly for NLP, for anybody who's obviously driven down there, you'll have seen sight of the fact that some of the former vacant units that we had for a period, those are now they are now either they've either got tenants in them, or you'll be seeing building work going on to introduce new tenants in. So I think the outlook is a positive one, and it's probably just a final input just to sort of say that I think at your next scheduled meeting in September, the commercial investment update report is coming, so you'll have your opportunity to sort of dive into the finer detail of that then.
Thank you, Peter. I was just going to mention that on the 23rd September we should be able to look at that, which is very helpful. Councillor Pavey, I noticed your hand's up again. Was it a follow-up or was that just a legacy or...?
It was just in relation to the my own question, Chair, and I appreciate the the Chief Officer for Education's response to the majority of the question that I posed, but it was in relation to our property services actively monitoring the quotes that we receive, or the schools receive, from providers that are on our framework. Are we monitoring to understand how those providers are coming to those specific quoted costs? And we have an open book approach with our care providers. Are we doing the same thing with our maintenance providers?
Peter, would you like to pick that up?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm coming in here as opposed to Will on the basis that it predominantly sits in and across with landlord services, property services specifically, in terms of their relationship in terms of supporting schools. And I think it's just to acknowledge, so the answer is, Councillor Pavia, it's yes. I think there has been work to be done, and that work is ongoing in terms of better developing, I think, the strengthening the relationship with schools in terms of that two-way flow of communication with regards to work that's been contracted. Important to say, and I was just having an exchange with Nick Keezer just off the back of that question being raised, just to make sure my understanding was correct. But Nick was confirming what I thought to be the case, which was one around the fact that we've got the cyclical and the mechanical engineering framework contracts they've just been recently renewed. We're scheduled to renew the building maintenance framework contractor as well. And I think it's been important just to sort of capture that feedback that we have done from schools in particular, to make sure that that's taken on board, and to make sure that the nature of the frameworks that we put in place allow for value for money, but at all levels. So when you talk about the plug replacement, for example, as distinct from something much more significant, that value for money is being derived, and schools understand the costs that are incumbent within that work needing to be done and validated and signed off, but making sure at the heart of it that the value for money is achieved.
Thank you. Thanks for the explanation. So just a couple of questions from me as we finish off this report, and in common with colleagues, thank you for the report. It's challenging times, we all understand that, but we all probably, I'm sure, also recognise that there isn't a 7th Cavalry that will be appearing to assist us. We need to find our own way through these challenges, and they were laid out very clearly in the financial strategy last week, that we've got a near £35 million identified shortfall across the 24-29 period. And the greatest of those shortfalls is in the next year, which is just over 12 million, 12.2 I think it was, million for next year. So that it's not in some distant future, it's very much here and now. And we're already looking at Q3 of the first year of the plan, before we see the financial plan that was talked about at last week's meeting. So within that context, the £4 million overspent at the end of last year on social care, health and safeguarding, communities, children, young people. We recognise why it's happening, but it's very difficult to see what is being done to address it. We can recognise that cutting costs has been part of this, but what we have heard a year ago is the need for change. And if the changes have been working, then why did the financial strategy last week identify the need for radical change to the operating model as we move forward? So the question there is, what is it that we're going to do to make radical change, to bring our costs under control? The second area of question is page 5 of the report refers to the service benefiting from a number of Welsh Government, this is the social care and health, benefiting from a number of Welsh Government grants, some of which are known to be short-term and others uncertain. It goes on to say grants are deeply integrated into the core delivery of the service and contribute heavily to managing demand and delivering savings. So to what extent are we dependent on those short-term grants that are uncertain as we move into this very, very challenging, or further into this very challenging environment? It'd be great if you could possibly address those points. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, Chair. If it's okay, Peter, I'll just come in and respond to your first point there, Chair. I think you made the point there that we're already in Q3 of the first year of the strategy, and I just mentioned that the strategy's it's not approved yet. It's not gone through full council, so it's not a strategy of the council yet until full council has given it its approval. You know, it's not saying it starts on the 1st of January 2024. It's saying it's from the period 2024 from its approval to 2029. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's a fair comment. Your point about what's being done to address the overspends is a very valid point. We touched on this, I think, considerably last week when we're looking out. I'd say, as I mentioned earlier, that we used the data from last year, you know, in our services, and you know, with those overspends that we've seen in order to inform this year's budget. And I do think that it's heartening to see that we did outperform our expectations in, you know, in between months 9 and outturn, which I think is definitely showing movement in the right direction. So I was pleased to see that. But again, more detail as we look out to the future will be provided in the financial plan as we come through the autumn, which should, you know, its intention is to really set that direction clearly in terms of the steps that we're going to take. Your second question on the reliance on short-term grants, I'll bring the officers in to provide a bit of detail to this, but it is something that we're very conscious of, and I think, you know, I feel for a lot of the staff whose positions are funded by grant funding, because it does allow a certain amount of uncertainty in their role when, you know, when we rely on grants for the services which they provide. You know, we continue to lobby Welsh Government to try and fold in more of that grant funding into our core revenue grants, so we can, you know, we can guarantee the security of some of those services that rely on that funding, and also, you know, those staff can have a little bit more job security where they rely on that funding. But in terms of our exposure to that, if it's okay, I'll hand over.
Thank you, Councillor Carr. Just before we do that, and thank you for the response. As I mentioned before, everybody in the committee recognises this is very challenging. So, you know, it's really understanding how we can, as a council, work our way through these challenges that we're asking questions. And it is obviously a really positive thing if in the last 3 months of the year the projected overspend was not as great as it turned out to be. So I absolutely recognise that, and it's good to see. But this core point of if what we're doing is working, why did last week's financial strategy say we now need radical change to the operating model? Yeah.
That's because our funding is not set to increase in real terms. So we are facing, you know, real terms cuts within the next year. So we are going to have to make changes to continue to deliver those services. It's not as a result of overspending. It's a result in, you know, a reduction in our spending power.
Thank you. The point about the financial strategy is well made, and of course it does need to be approved by full council. It wasn't the point I was making. I was simply saying that what we heard last week was that it will be Q3, I think it was said, before we see the financial plan that gives evidence of what these changes are going to be, what these absolutely critical transformation, radical changes to the operating model will be. And that's really what I was referring to, Q3, and that would be Q3 of the first year of the financial plan. But anyway, let's, if I may, move on to the second part of those questions on the issue of grants and our dependency on them or otherwise, our risk exposure, I suppose, Peter.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'll just come back, just point of clarification. I think it's important for it to be captured. I think Councillor Callard has rightly referenced the fact that the strategy, it goes to Council on Thursday and hopefully approved. And again, to respond, I think maybe to Councillor Buckler's earlier question, that provides the strategic framework. The medium-term financial plan is going to have an increase in tempo. That's going to be produced and brought forward, through the political decision-making process on a 6-monthly basis. The first of those updates will be coming through Scrutiny at its next meeting in September, and then into Cabinet, and then in the ordinary way of sort of dovetailing into the work of the budget, you'd expect the other 6-monthly update to sort of be in that sort of January-February period. So that's just a point of clarification on that. It's also important to highlight, just to make sure that there's not a misunderstanding, that programme of change and improvement is something that needs to evolve in addition to, or as a complement to, the community and corporate plan and the medium-term financial plan. It will not be delivered through the medium-term financial plan. There needs to be political and senior officer sort of strategic ownership of the development of that programme of work. And that will clearly continue to evolve, because we're going to have to adapt and change through the medium term. But I guess to the question that I think has been more precisely asked as to when will we see some more substance and detail to that, well, I'd certainly expect that to be forthcoming in the autumn, and clearly needed in terms of initially informing the budget round that is first with us for 25-26. In terms of specific grants, I think the point is very well made. I think the point is captured and acknowledged in the report as well. I think it's a risk that actually exists not just with social care. I could probably look at my colleagues in the room, I look at Francis and Will and others. That same specific one-off grant funding risks sits with all directorates and services. And the important in this, I think, is some of the discourse and dialogue taking place between leaders and the Minister through the WLGA. I know that Welsh Government has sort of started a programme of work looking at streamlining and sort of rationalising specific grant funding, and actually looking to identify potentially, and I think this is probably a point forward for Welsh Government, but actually trying to transfer specific grant funded more transparently into the core settlement to give local authorities greater flexibility in terms of the use of that money. But I would be really careful how I frame this, but I think it's important that we make sure that we hold Welsh Government to account, I guess, in the sense of ensuring that we get the very best core settlement out of the Welsh Government, but make sure that that is not achieved by way of just top slicing off specific grant funding pots. We need to make a very strong case for local government in order to make sure that both core grant and specific grant funding is maintained at appropriate levels, and actually, to my earlier point, that we see the money in core grant more so than in specific grant funding, because I think the points that are highlighted in terms of putting people, into posts, grant funded posts for, short-term, 1-year, 2-year positions, it's not particularly conducive, I think, to sort of, developing a workforce and trying to deliver on your core focus. So I think point well made, and I think it's an active thread of discussion through my networks, through the Society of Welsh Treasurers, and down through the WLGA and with Welsh Government officials. And as I said, it'll be the same, I'm sure, for Councillor Callard and through his networks through the WLGA into the Minister, as much as with leaders as well.
Thank you, Peter. And the uncertainty, I guess, around these is just merely highlighted by what's been happening while we've been meeting, with the resignation of the First Minister while we've been meeting. Things seem to happen while we meet. I think they do it when we're busy, occupied elsewhere. I noticed Gareth Southgate has also resigned, so I wonder which of these is going to get the most attention in the national media. Just one last question, if I may. The overspend that we've described, around 4 million, was substantially offset by 2.7 million underspend in what's described as strategic initiatives. Can you just unpack what those strategic initiatives would have been that haven't taken place?
Yeah, I can take that, Chair, thank you. I think if we just take ourselves back to the start of the 23-24 financial year, the budget was supported by £3 million of reserve funding that supplemented the budget. Throughout the year, a further £2.5 million was approved by Cabinet. I think it was around month 2 that took place. What part of that reserve funding did was, I think as we heard earlier, it delayed some of the service budget savings needing to come forward so quickly, but also the other part of it provided a budget contingency to protect against what we were seeing at the time, double-digit inflation and cost pressures that were impacting services. So the underspend effectively that we see there on that line is that contingency budget, which hasn't been drawn upon, so offsets against those overspends and cost pressures that you outline, Chair. So I think it's as simple as that.
Okay, thank you. And I notice Councillor Pavia and Councillor Buckler, you've put, I'll call them late hands up. And if I could ask, first of all, Councillor Pavia, but if you could be brief, or is that the same hand?
That's the same hand, Chair.
Oh, sorry. And Councillor Buckler, is that a new one or an old one, a legacy one?
Well, actually, it's just to flag up, and there's sort of significant budget revisions and slippage in key infrastructure projects, and I just wanted to know why that was the case. Particularly with the King Henry VIII Future Schools project and the various active travel routes. Funding. So it was just something, obviously there's so much in this financial report that we can pick out, but there was just something I felt hasn't been addressed yet.
Thank you, Councillor Buckler. Response to this, I'd like to be really brief if you would. I know we've picked up the King Henry issue previously, which has been directly the cause of problems with the windows in the construction, as I understand it, the frames, and a number of us as councillors were showing the premises, which look fantastic. And I understand, Will, that the latest date remains around Easter, which is a delay, but we were, I think, given the direct reasons for that previously. But in the broader context of Councillor Buckler's question about not meeting the infrastructure targets, would you want to address that, Jonathan?
Thank you, Chair. And yeah, I will be brief. I think, by their very nature, the capital schemes are multi-year. We do have a tendency for some of the profiling of that spend to be slightly over-optimistic, and we've worked with budget holders over the past couple of years to improve that. The vast majority of that figure that we'll see is to do with the King Henry issue, and that slight revision to the programme of works there. In terms of the wider infrastructure point, and I take that to mean the highways infrastructure programme, some of the bridge replacement and supplementary works. I think what we've experienced there is a need for some further scoping works to be undertaken, and we've experienced a few delays, certainly in terms of some of the supply chain and also the availability of contractors to come in to do some of those initial works and scoping works within that programme. So again, I go back to the fact that these are big, significant schemes, and it's not surprising for us that we're seeing some slippage within these, but that would be the main reasons for it.
So it's the nature of major projects like that. They don't fit neatly into 12-month periods as our budgets do. I guess is partly what you're saying there, Jonathan, yeah? No. Okay, thank you for that. And I'm going to move us forward and move the report. And thank you for everyone who's been involved in responses and questions. It's a very important report, and as we move forward, a very important year. And also, thank you, Councillor Callard, for the responses, and I hope your daughter is well very soon. I'm not sure if you pass on the best wishes of the Performance and Overview Scrutiny Committee. That will do her a whole lot of good, but you're very welcome to do so from all of us. I hope she's well very soon. We'll move on to the forward plan, which is item number 6, and I don't know, Robert, if there's anything you wanted to add to that.
Just a note for members, excuse me, that just a reminder that ahead of our next meeting, the next meeting of, well, the next after tomorrow meeting of People Scrutiny, which is a week today, where members of this committee are cordially invited to that, because it's going to cover the Care Inspectorate Wales Inspection Report and Home to School Transport. So that was something that's on the work programme. I just wanted to draw attention to it. But also, in terms of the earlier discussion in the self-assessment item, homelessness and care leavers were brought up, and that is already on the agenda for tomorrow's meeting of People with the rapid rehousing update. So I just wanted to draw everyone's attention that you're more than welcome to attend that tomorrow, where that's already being covered.
Thank you, Robert. That's really good. And in fact, if you wanted to do so, I'm sure the chair would accommodate questions. It would be after the other committee members, but there's no reason why that wouldn't be possible.
Yes, of course, yes.
Great. So Cabinet, item 7, Cabinet and Council Planner for information. Item 8 is the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 18th of June, which I move, and I see Councillor Bond with your hand up.
Just something that was mentioned at a previous meeting. There's, I know that Mark Hand has left. I wonder if the work has been reallocated, because his name still appears in that council plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. Well spotted.
Yes, it was noted in the minutes, but yeah, Craig O'Connor is now head of placemaking, but that was noted as an amendment there.
Okay. Great, thank you, Councillor Bond. Well spotted. So I move the minutes and see no objections, so they are agreed. And the next meeting, thank you for everybody attending this meeting. I know we've had to pack a couple of meetings into short time frames in the last week or so, so much appreciate you doing that. We've just needed to cover a lot of ground. And you can imagine if we had tried to cover this agenda and last week's agenda in one meeting, I think it would have been rather testing on a whole series of matters. But thank you. Next meeting, 23rd of September at 10 a.m. and we look forward to seeing you then. If I don't see you before then, I hope you have a very good break wherever you are able to go. Thanks again. Bye now.